He had survived the jungles of Vietnam, but not without scars. A wheelchair now carried him where his legs once had. Backstage in Vegas, 1976. Elvis was minutes from walking out. Then a voice called his name, shaky, deep, and filled with history. Stick with me, because what Elvis did next would silence the room, break the rules, and leave one man with a gift he carried for the rest of his life. The metallic clunk of the backstage door echoed down the corridor. A draft of cooler desert night air slipped inside, carrying the faint smell of cigarette smoke from the loading dock. Under the harsh fluorescent light stood a man in worn fatigues, the kind you'd expect in a war zone, not behind the stage of the International Hotel in Las Vegas. He was seated in a wheelchair. His hands gripped the armrests so tightly his knuckles whitened. The chair's rubber wheels were scuffed, its footrests scratched bare of paint. The man's name, according to crew whispers, was Tom. No last name, no introduction, just Tom. Some say he'd been waiting there for over an hour, hoping Elvis would walk past on his way to the stage. And now, with the muffled sound of the band tuning up down the hall, this was his moment. Elvis, the voice was deep, but unsteady. I just want to sing you something. At the far end of the hallway, Elvis Presley was adjusting his cufflinks in the mirror of his dressing room door. White jumpsuit catching the overhead light. His band's bass line thumped faintly through the walls. He paused, looked over his shoulder. A stagehand muttered, "We're on in 10." Elvis didn't answer. He stepped away from the mirror, walking slowly toward the voice. Each step sounded heavier than the last. Boots tapping on the linoleum. The chatter of the crew dimmed, as if everyone knew something unusual was about to happen. By the time Elvis reached the man, they were barely 2 feet apart. The veteran's eyes glistened under the buzzing lights. Sweat traced a line down his temple. Elvis stood still, saying nothing for a moment, just looking at him, as if he was measuring more than just a request. Finally, with the faintest nod, he spoke. "Go ahead." And the corridor seemed to hold its breath. Even the bass from the stage faded into the background. No one could have guessed that in less than an hour, 18,000 people would be part of this moment, or that a week later something would arrive at Tom's doorstep that he'd keep until his last days. Tom's fingers tightened on the armrest. For a second, nothing came out, just the sound of his breath, uneven, almost like he was steadying himself against a memory. Then quietly at first, he began. "Are you lonesome tonight?" The notes carried down the narrow cinder block hallway, warm and raw. The walls threw the sound back in little echoes, filling the empty spaces between words. This wasn't a stage voice. It was a living room voice, the kind sung over a radio when no one else is home. Elvis crossed his arm. His expression softened, the corners of his mouth just hinting at a smile. From the doorway to the dressing room, a backup singer stopped mid-sip of her coffee, her eyes fixed on the man in the chair. Halfway through the verse, Tom's voice cracked, just for a moment. He pushed through it, but the break hung in the air like a bruise. The corridor went still. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed quieter, a movement, subtle but unmistakable. Elvis uncrossed his arms, stepped closer, and without a word began to sing along, not in full voice, just enough so their tones met and blended, one smooth, one weathered. The air between them shifted. This wasn't fan and icon anymore. It was two men sharing the same song for reasons no one else could fully understand. At the far end of the hall, a crew member took a step forward, ready to break it up. The clock was ticking. The show was already running late. Elvis lifted his hand without looking. A quiet, final signal. Let it be. They reached the last lines together. "Shall I come back again? Tell me, dear, are you lonesome tonight?" The final note wavered and settled into silence. Elvis crouched until his face was level with Tom's. The sequins on his jumpsuit caught the light, sending little flashes across the wall. His voice dropped low. "You've still got the heart for it," he said. Tom's lips pressed into something between a smile and a tremor. Then, with careful hands, he reached into his lap and pulled out a small, creased photograph. It looked old, edges bent, colors faded. He held it out without a word. Elvis took it, tilting it toward the light. His thumb brushed across the image, lingering there. Whatever was in that picture, It froze him in place. Down the hall, the roar of the audience swelled. The announcer's voice boomed through the sound system, calling the king to the stage. But Elvis didn't move. Not yet. What he saw in that photo would change the rest of the night. The image in Elvis's hands was grainy, worn from years of being folded and unfolded. In it, a much younger Tom sat cross-legged in a clearing, jungle foliage thick behind him. His hair was darker then, his smile wide despite the rifle leaning against his shoulder. On the back, faded blue ink told its own story. Saigon, 1968. Listening to Elvis on the radio, Elvis ran his thumb slowly across the words, as though tracing the time and distance they carried. "You were over there?" he asked quietly. Tom nodded. "We had this little battery set. Somebody would catch your songs on the Armed Forces Network. That was home. For a few minutes anyway." For a moment, neither man spoke. The low hum of an amplifier down the hall filled the space between them. Somewhere beyond the curtain, the crowd's murmur swelled. A wave of voices, restless for the show to start. But Elvis stayed where he was. He turned the photo back over, studying the lines of the younger man's face. "How long ago was that taken?" Tom looked down at his hands, one gripping the chair's worn armrest, the other holding a faded military cap. "Feels like yesterday. Feels like a lifetime." A stagehand appeared at the corner tapping his watch. The announcer's booming voice drifted in from the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," but Elvis didn't move toward the curtain. He slid the photo into his palm like something fragile and stood, glancing once more at the man in front of him. The crowd's roar was now a living thing, rattling the walls. But Elvis's voice cut through it, calm, steady, certain. "I'm changing the show tonight." The words landed like a dropped pin in the hallway. The backup singer's eyes widened. The stagehand froze. Tom blinked, unsure if he'd heard right, but Elvis was already turning toward the stage manager, the photo still in his hand. The murmur of the crew shifted from impatience to confusion. What did he mean by changing the show? The set list had been locked for days. None of them could guess what was about to happen. Elvis turned the corner, the photo still tucked in his palm. He found the stage manager leaning over a clipboard. "Bring him out," Elvis said, nodding back toward Tom. The manager looked up, confused. "Bring the man in the wheelchair," Elvis replied, already moving past him. The manager stepped into his path. "We don't have a ramp, It's not." Elvis stopped. His voice was quiet, but there was no mistaking the weight in it. "Then we'll make one." Within seconds, the crew was in motion. Two men rolled a portable platform toward the side curtain. Someone else was clearing cables from the path. The urgency shifted. No longer about starting the show on time, but about making space for something unexpected. Down the hallway, Tom sat waiting, his hands still holding the military cap. He glanced toward the commotion, unsure if this was really happening. Then Elvis appeared beside him. He rested one hand on the back of the wheelchair. "You ready?" Tom hesitated. "For what?" Elvis smiled faintly. "You'll see." The bass line from Also Sprach Zarathustra, his iconic entrance, began to rumble through the speakers. The floor seemed to vibrate beneath them. As the crew rolled Tom toward the curtain, the air changed. Behind them, the bright fluorescence of backstage gave way to the dim, electric glow spilling in from the arena. The crowd's roar was a tidal wave now, hitting in pulses. Tom's breathing quickened, his fingers curled tight around the armrest. Elvis leaned down so his voice would be heard over the music. "We'll do this together." The curtain was only a few steps away. From the other side came the deafening cheer of 18,000 people, who had no idea what was about to happen. A spotlight swung into place, its beam cutting through the haze above the stage. You could see the dust swirling in the light. Tom glanced at Elvis, the king of rock and roll in his white suit, sequins flashing like tiny mirrors, and then at the sheer wall of sound waiting beyond the curtain. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. "Hang on," Elvis said, gripping the wheelchair handles. The stage manager gave the cue. The curtain began to part. The spotlight hit instantly, blinding and hot. The crowd's cheer rose into a roar, and there they were. Elvis Presley, arm draped around a man in uniform, rolling forward together into the heart of the stage. Gasps rippled through the front rows. A woman covered her mouth. A man lowered his camera, too stunned to take the shot. No one knew what was about to happen next. Not even Tom. The cheers faded into a confused murmur as Elvis stepped to the microphone. He didn't give the usual opener, no flashy introduction, just a glance over his shoulder at Tom, then back to the audience. "This man sang to me tonight," Elvis said, his voice carrying across the arena. "I'd like to sing with him now." A ripple went through the crowd. Surprise, curiosity. Elvis strummed the first soft chords of "Are You Lonesome Tonight?" The arena fell silent, save for the gentle hum of the sound system. After a few bars, Elvis turned to Tom and gave a small nod. Tom's voice was shaky at first, barely rising above the guitar, but the microphone caught every note, sending it up into the rafters. The first rows leaned forward. You could hear the faint rustle of programs being lowered into laps. Then something shifted. The tremor in Tom's voice began to fade. His tone steadied, grew full. Elvis harmonized, his rich baritone blending with the veteran's worn but steady sound. By the second verse, the applause started soft at first, then building. Pockets of the crowd began clapping in rhythm. From the wings, the backup singers exchanged glances. One of them wiped a tear before stepping closer to the mic, joining in on the harmonies. It was no longer just two men singing. It was 18,000 voices, some loud, some just mouthing the words, all caught in the moment. A woman in the front row pressed a hand to her heart. A man, a few seats over, closed his eyes, swaying slightly. You could feel the air in the room change, heavier, but warmer. As they reached the final line, the audience's singing swelled, carrying the last note like a wave lifting them to shore. The song ended, but the silence that followed was almost louder than the applause that came next. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the sound hit, a wall of cheers, whistles, stomps, a roar so big it seemed to vibrate the stage beneath their feet. Elvis turned to Tom. In one fluid motion, he slipped the white silk scarf from his own neck and draped it gently over Tom's shoulders. He leaned down, close enough that the microphone didn't catch the words. Only Tom heard them. Tom's eyes widened, then softened. He gave the smallest nod. The crowd had no idea what Elvis had just said, but they knew they'd seen something they would never forget. A week later, in a quiet apartment on the outskirts of town, Tom heard a knock at the door. No one was expecting. He wheeled himself to the entry and opened it to find a delivery man holding a long rectangular package. The return label read simply "Memphis, Tennessee." Inside, nestled in brown paper, was a Gibson acoustic guitar. The finish was worn smooth along the neck, as if it had played 1,000 songs. A small envelope rested against the strings. Tom opened it carefully. On a single sheet of paper in unmistakable handwriting were the words, "You'll always have a seat in the front row." Tom's hands trembled as he set the note down. He lifted the guitar from the case, the scent of wood and old strings rising up. It wasn't a collector's piece to him. It was a living thing. A bridge back to that night, under the lights, when he'd been more than just a man in a chair. According to his family, Tom played that guitar every night from then on. Even when his fingers grew stiff, he would rest it on his lap and strum a few chords. The scarf Elvis had draped over his shoulders stayed folded on the dresser beside. That Vegas night became his anchor, proof that someone had seen him, not for his injuries, not for his uniform, but for the voice and the heart he still carried. When friends visited, he'd tell them the story, but there was always one part he kept to himself. The words Elvis whispered on stage. Tom never repeated them aloud, and maybe that was the point. Some moments are meant to live only between the people who shared them. If this story touched you, share it with someone who believes kindness can echo for a lifetime. What's the one moment of compassion you've never forgotten?